do, 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 do. Welcome back to what may be the most disturbing series of experiments ever conceived by the human mind. Two numbers. 6767. That one's for Gen Alpha. Sorry to everyone. Yeah, I'm terribly sorry for everyone. Who knew when memes actually made sense, when jokes required context, and when numbers didn't carry entire internet subcultures behind them. But jokes aside, there was nothing funny about the story of Vault-67. Most people believe they already know it. They hear a few key words: overcrowding, cannibalism, factions, and they assume that is the entire tale. A grim curiosity, a shocking footnote in the long list of Vault-Tec's morally bankrupt experiments. But the truth behind Vault-67 is far more unsettling, because it is not merely a story about madness. It is a story about how fragile human civilization can be when stripped of space, stability, and hope. Vault-67 began with a single question, one that Vault-Tec engineers believed could be answered with data charts and observations. How much social pressure can human beings endure before society collapses? The experiment itself was deceptively simple. A vault designed to house a reasonable population was instead filled far beyond capacity. There were too many people, too few beds, too little space, and not nearly enough privacy. Hallways became dormitories, storage rooms became bedrooms, families slept amongst each other, children learned to walk between rows of strangers. At first, this seemed manageable. Committees were formed, rules were written, schedules were created to regulate eating, sleeping, bathing, and working hours. People believed that if they planned carefully, if they shared fairly, if they followed the rules, order could be maintained. But overcrowding does not only strain resources, it erodes identity. When people cannot claim personal space, when they cannot escape noise, when every conversation is overheard and every argument became public, the self begins to dissolve. Privacy disappears. Dignity weakens. Strangers stop being neighbors and start becoming obstacles. Small annoyances turn into grudges. Grudges turn into hatred. Hatred turns into violence. Over time, the population of Vault-67 divided into factions and cliques, each with its own morals, rules, and beliefs. Some groups believed in strict equality, where every resource was shared regardless of contribution. Others believed that the strongest should rule, that survival required hierarchy and force. Some turned to religion, searching for meaning and divine judgment. Others trusted only discipline and punishment. Each group believed that they alone could understand how survival should work. Each group believed that others were dangerous. Conflict was inevitable. At first, violence was rare. A fight in a hallway, a theft in a storage room, a beating in a dark corner of the vault. These incidences were punished and life went on. Then violence became common. Soon it became policy. Execution were always the same. There were too many people and not enough resources. Every death was framed as a mathematical solution. Food shortages followed quickly. Rationing became severe. Portions shrank. Meals were skipped. Adults gave up food for children. The elderly starved quietly. The sick were ignored. Medical care became a luxury. Eventually, even the young people began to die. And that was when Vault-67 crossed the final boundary. Cannibalism did not begin as madness. It began as desperation. At first, only the dead were eaten. Bodies that would have been buried were instead butchered in secret. Then the executed were eaten. Then people were executed to be eaten. What began as survival became systemized. Human life was no longer sacred. It was measured on calories. Children grew up learning that when people disappeared, food appeared. 5-year-olds learn how to chew human flesh before they learn how to read. Families hid their children at night. Factions hunted one another in organized raids. The Vault entered a horrifying cycle. Overcrowding led to purging. Purging led to cannibalism. Cannibalism stabilized the population. The overcrowding began again. If you think being a young person in Gen Z is stressful enough, imagine growing up in a vault where your classmates are starving and your neighbors are deciding whether to eat your parents or not. Vault-67 did not fail. It proved that humans could be broken, organized, and made to survive in hell. And that proof was the true goal all along. But as disturbing as Vault-67 was, it was only the beginning. Because if you think 67 was bad, wait until you hear about Vault-68. As the Vault was not designed to study overcrowding, starvation, or social collapse. Vault-68 was designed to study control. 999 men and one single woman. From the very first moment the vault doors sealed, inbounds was not an accident. It was the foundations of the experiment. The population was never meant to form a stable or healthy society. It was constructed to guarantee tension, rivalry, and obsession from the start. Every interaction, every decision, every conflict would be shaped by a single fact. There was only one woman. In Vault-68, scarcity was not food or water. Scarcity was reproduction. From the beginning, the woman was not treated as a person. She was treated as an asset, a living resource whose body determined the future of the entire population of her entire vault. Her name became irrelevant. Her past was erased. Her individuality was slowly stripped away until she existed only as a function within the system of the vault. Her entire life was reduced to reproduction. She was forced to give birth repeatedly, year after year, with no choice and no escape. There were no years of rest, no periods of recovery, no consideration for her health or sanity. Every pregnancy was planned by others. Every birth was recorded as data. Her pain was not a tragedy, it was a metric. If she gave birth to a boy, the child's fate was decided immediately. Most either killed to control the population or sent into labor as soon as they were physically able to work. Childhood ended early in Vault-68. Boys were raised knowing that their lives were disposable. That strength was the only protection they had. And that weakness meant death. If she gave birth to a girl, the rules changed. That child was protected until she was able to start giving birth. Not loved, not cherished, preserved. She was isolated from the general population and raised carefully under constant supervision. Her education was tightly controlled. Her movements were restricted. She was taught obedience, endurance, and silence. Not for her happiness, not for her freedom, but so that one day, when her mother's body finally failed, she could take her place. Generations after generations, the same cycle repeated. Meanwhile, the men fought among themselves. Competition became the defining force of life in Vault 68. Every man knew that survival depended on status. Every man knew that power meant access to food, to safety, to influence, and above all, to reproduction. Most were killed. Some were broken into slaves. A small elite group rose to the top, using violence, alliances, and betrayal to secure dominance. They controlled the armory. They controlled the food supply. They controlled the guards. They controlled the schedules. And most importantly, they controlled access to the women and children. They created a rigid hierarchy where rank determined survival. At the top were the rulers, a handful of men who lived in relative comfort, insulated from labor and danger. Beneath them were enforcers and administrators. Beneath that were workers. And at the bottom were the expendable, the weak, the sick, and the unlucky. Short men died. Weak men died. Men who lost fights died. Men who challenged the hierarchy died. Vault 68 became a caste system built on violence, forced labor, and genetic control. Every birth, every death, every promotion, every execution reinforced the same truth. Human life had only value as long as it proceeded with the experiment. Love did not exist. Families barely existed. Everything was transactional. Everything was political. And though it all, the cycle continued. One woman giving birth, one girl being prepared to replace her, hundreds of men killing one another for position. The society engineered not to thrive but to consume itself. Vault 68 proved that something terrifying, not that humans are violent, not that humans are cruel, but that when reproduction becomes a weapon, when birth itself becomes a tool of power, society does not simply collapse, it becomes a prison, and the bars are made not of steel, but of biology, hierarchy, and fear! And then there's everyone's favorite cursed number, Vault 69. One man, 999 women. On paper, it sounded almost like a joke. The kind of scenario someone would invent as a dark piece of satire. Compared to the horrors of starvation and forced labor, this experiment was often dismissed as indulgent, even merciful. Many who first heard of it assumed it would be easy, even pleasant. They were wrong. From the moment the vault door sealed, Vault 69 was shaped by a single, unavoidable truth. The future of the entire population depended on one man. At first, he was celebrated. He was treated as a symbol of hope, a living guarantee that humanity inside the vault would continue. Ceremonies were held when the first children were conceived. His name was spoken with reverence. He was given the best food, the best medical care, the best living quarters. Guards followed him, everywhere, not to protect him as a person, but to protect what he represented. He was not a citizen, he was an infrastructure. Every family wanted their bloodline to matter and to continue. Every woman wanted her child to have status. Every group wanted influence over reproduction. At first, pairings were organized by committee, doctors, administrators, and technicians create schedules. Rotations were planned. Genetics were tracked carefully to avoid obvious defects. Children were cataloged like inventory. Birth records became political documents. Soon, however, biology turned into politics. Framing families began forming alliances. Women competed quietly for favor. Administrators accepted bribes. Schedules were altered. Records were falsified. The question was no longer how to preserve the species. It was whose children would rule the future. Politics formed around bloodlines. Some children were raised as heirs. Others were treated as expendable. Families fought over inheritance rights to housing, food, and authority. Siblings became rivals. Mothers trained their children not in kindness or cooperation, but in manipulation. Love meant nothing. Romance meant nothing. Everything was transactional. Genetics meant everything. The man himself slowly lost control over his own life. At first, he had a voice in the process, then a suggestion, then only compliance. He was forced into endless reproduction. There were no private relationship, no meaningful bonds. Every encounter was scheduled. Every choice was approved by others. His body became public property. His time divided into quotas and obligations. Harems formed not out of desire but out of administrations. Different factions claimed exclusive access to certain periods of his life. Rival groups fought for his priority. Guards escorted him from room to room like a valuable shipment. Rival factions formed. Political blocs emerged. Each group supported its preferred children. Each group plotted to remove rivals. Assassination attempts followed, not always against him, often against his children, sometimes against the mothers, sometimes against administrators who favored the wrong bloodline as they perceived. The Vault became a battlefield, a subtle war, poisoning, staged accidents, manipulated illnesses, disappearances disguised as medical failures. Through it all, he lived under constant guard, not for safety, but to protect the Vault's future supply of children. If he died, the experiment ended. If he was injured, generations were at risk. If he rebelled, the entire society could collapse. He became both a king and a prisoner at the same time, surrounded by luxury, but unable to leave, surrounded by people, but completely alone. Every word he spoke was recorded, every movement was monitored, every relationship was supervised. He could not choose love. He could not choose family. He could not choose escape. He could only choose survival. As years passed, the pressure began to break him. Sleep became difficult. Trust became impossible. Every smile might be manipulation. Every kindness might be strategy. Every child who called him father might one day try to kill him to secure their own future. The future of the entire vault depended on one man's DNA. And that kind of pressure destroys people. Not with violence, not with starvation, but with isolation, with paranoia. With a slow realization that your life no longer belongs to you and never will again. Vault 69 prides something different from the others. Not that hunger destroyed morality, not that power destroyed dignity, but that when one human being becomes the foundation of an entire civilization, that civilization will crush him to keep itself alive. By the end of these experiments, one truth became impossible to ignore. Vault-Tec was never about saving humanity. It was about testing how easily it could be broken. Vault 67 showed how hunger destroyed morality. Vault 68 showed how power destroys dignity. And Vault 69 shows how control destroys identity. These were no accidents. These were designs. And if you think those experiments are crazy, just wait until you see my Vault 31, 32, and 33 synopsis right up here. Or if you want, you can watch me solve the FNAF lore. The FNAF lore, not lore. FNAF lore, using only the first 4 games. It's your choice, but choose very carefully. Otherwise, you might end up in a vault.